My name is Nkirote Laiboni, a human rights lawyer by training, meaning that I studied law and I studied human rights, and I also studied international relations, but a researcher, policy analyst, and programs manager in practice.
Okay, so what sparked your interest in migration rights specifically? Because human rights has such an array of inequalities. So why migration rights specifically, especially for a Kenyan context?
I think Kenya is interesting. Well, first of all, at a more personal level, I think I'm just personally just very curious about movement, really, and just the othering, the process of othering of migrants. I'm a very curious person. I've always enjoyed moving, and I think also personal history. I've had the opportunity, in my family, this is getting very personal, but we lived in rural Kenya, and then we moved to Nairobi, and I think that sparked a certain interest. But then I've had the opportunity as an adult also to move around a fair bit, and so I've experienced what it means to be a migrant, both internally within the country, but then also externally as well. As a student, as a graduate student, and as I guess you could call it a migrant worker or a professional migrant. So I understand that the concept of having to adapt to a new culture, having to deal with discrimination, racism, and having to really push yourself and to learn about your country of destination, to learn about the way things work, the way the systems work in that country, but then also to grapple with a lot of challenges, because it's not always, regardless of your status, economic status, and level of education, it's never easy to start over anywhere. It fascinates me, at a personal level, at a psychological level as well, just the level of resilience that people have to go through or have to endure when they move somewhere new. And I think that resilience, that level of adaptation and those struggles, and sometimes they're very internal. It's not necessarily external. Sometimes those struggles will definitely be felt more if you are of a lower economic status, if you are undocumented, if you're moving somewhere without the right papers, or if you've overstayed, then of course, then you have to, it's more challenging. It's much more challenging. And if you go somewhere where you have to adapt to, the culture is completely different from yours, the language is a language barrier. Obviously, those challenges and complexities are much more difficult to adapt with.
Reasons why people move out of Kenya in the first place, right? Because we know it's a developing country. There's quite a lot of economic problems, a lot of social problems. So can you give us a brief overview of why do you think people move from Kenya?
But I think when you think of more mid-income or more low-skilled migrant workers, then you see that there's an increasing demand, and not just from Kenya, but from other countries in the region, like Uganda and Ethiopia as well, for migrant domestic workers, care workers, but then also when you think of men who move to those countries in the Gulf and the rest of the Middle East, then of course there's also demand for drivers, construction workers as well. And this increasing demand for workers in the Middle East is obviously based on quite a number of factors. The first one being, obviously, there's demand. I mean, these are oil-rich countries, and some of this, sectors or positions are deemed to be too low level for the nationals of those countries to fill. And so, of course, they will look at, historically, they've looked at Southeast Asia and South Asia, countries like India, countries like Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, Philippines as well has been, a key country of origin for migrant workers to go to the Gulf in the Middle East. And this is, for probably 30 years now, 3 decades. Ethiopia in this region has always been, compared to other countries, since the 80s, Ethiopia has been supplying labor to those countries. But in the last, let's say, probably decade, we have been seeing a trend from Kenya and Uganda, and quite recently I've heard that Rwanda as well has signed bilateral labor agreements with some of these countries in the Middle East. I believe it's with Saudi Arabia. So we are seeing increasing demand from Eastern Africa, beyond Ethiopia, but also other countries in Eastern Africa as well. And of course, because there's increasing trends rather. Of course, that's because there's demand in those countries, but then also there's rising unemployment rates here in this part of the world. So people are moving for those reasons, but also people are moving because we are all aspirational. We all want better for ourselves. So regardless of economic status, regardless of where you are in life, and regardless of region, in countries like Poland and Romania, for instance, and those are like in Eastern Europe, those are some of the key countries of origin. Since these countries joined the EU, I believe since 2011. There's been massive movement. Massive movement from those countries. In fact, you'd go to some places in Romania and you find like some villages are completely, empty. They've become depopulated. And these people are moving because primarily for aspirational reasons. The life is better. There are more opportunities in the Western Europe. There are more, opportunities for personal development. There are more opportunities to grow. There's more opportunity to actually earn to have a higher standard of living, but then also earn more money compared to back home. So that's, there's not much of a difference looking at Eastern Europe or East Africa. Really, the reasons are more or less the same. But here, of course, we are seeing that in Kenya and other parts of the region, like this, quite, the population of young people is quite big, and the population is growing. Whereas in the other side of the world, population, those countries are becoming more depopulated. Here, the population is growing, and so which means it's a higher demand for work, and unfortunately, not enough jobs are being created to fill that demand. So then we see more and more people go. But also, one of the interesting things I've observed, Brenda, is it seems also some governments in this part of the world are seeing labor migration as a way of addressing this unemployment. So there's an element of sort of, what word should I use? Encouragement. Young people are being encouraged to go to the Middle East and find work there.
So in fact, that was going to be my next question. We know that it's quite difficult as an African to move, and not only within the African continent, but also to move outside of the African continent. But now that we're seeing more and more Africans, and specifically Kenyans, migrating to these countries, why do you think it's much easier to go to Lebanon, for instance, or Qatar compared to going to the UK? Does that mean that the government makes it easier, facilitates it for Kenyans who wish to go to migrate for work?
Okay, if you look at Europe, of course, European countries have become very nationalistic since the so-called migration crisis of, I think it was 2015, of 2015. Movements from Africa, migration from Africa to Europe, also migration from Syria and other parts of the Middle East to Europe has also become quite restricted. And countries have become, at EU level, within the UK as well, lots of restrictions. So it's becoming harder for any African who has aspirations to move to Europe to go there. And then you see on the flip side that, countries in Eastern Africa are now, negotiating or even signing bilateral labor agreements with countries in the Middle East. And these agreements actually allow, or rather it's a process of just facilitating that movement of laborers from Kenya or from Uganda or from Ethiopia or Rwanda or elsewhere in the region to the Middle East and to go and work in specific sectors. Because there's a high demand for domestic workers in this region, in the Gulf and the Middle East, then of course some of these bilateral labor agreements are very specific to domestic workers. So for instance, the labor agreement that Kenya has signed with Saudi Arabia is specific to domestic workers. And, it talks about like the minimum wage, for instance, for domestic workers, which is about like $375 per month as minimum wage. So it's very specific to domestic workers. Of course, Saudi Arabia is attracting workers in other sectors from Kenya, but this particular bilateral labor agreement is specific to domestic workers. Yeah. And so, when you see such agreements and it specifies what process a migrant should follow, a prospective migrant should follow in order to go to the Middle East, including receiving, pre-departure training with training agencies that are accredited with the national NITA, the national agency that, for training that falls. This agency falls under the Ministry of Labor and Social Protection. Going through this pre-departure training, ensuring that you have a contract as a migrant domestic worker, having that contract attested by a labor officer, which also sits under the Ministry of Labor. Of course, ensuring that you've gone through this whole process is managed by a private employment agency that is, again, accredited, registered, and accredited by the Ministry of Labor. So they're actually like administrative processes, official processes that are recognized and that are overseen by the Ministry of Labor and Social Protection. So with such processes in place, then it becomes much easier for agencies, because of course in Kenya, in the countries of destination like Kenya, the private agencies will work closely with the private agencies, in Kenya, will work closely with the private agencies in the countries of destination such as Lebanon, so that they're able to facilitate this employment process, because the prospective employers in the countries of origin will then go to an agent there and say, I'm looking to hire a migrant worker from, do you have any? I'm looking to hire a domestic worker, do you have any? And this is what I'm willing to pay. And then this agent will then work with their partner agent in Kenya to facilitate that process. And of course, throughout this whole process, the migrant domestic worker, if we're talking specifically to do in relation to the migrant domestic worker, the contractual process or the employment process is managed by the two agents in the two countries. But ultimately, the person sponsoring this whole process is the employer. And of course, in these countries in the Middle East, the employment system is guided by, or the migrant employment system is guided by what is called the kafala system. And so in that system, it's people refer to it as a sponsorship system, because under that kafala system, it's the employer who covers the cost of all this. Basically, the migrant domestic worker is not supposed to cover any costs. So the employer in Lebanon, for instance, or Saudi Arabia, or Qatar, Kuwait, will cover the costs for the visa, for ideally even for the medical tests that the worker should undertake before they even sign that contract. For the passport, if they don't have access to a passport, because if they don't have a passport, then the agent in Kenya will have to process one. For any other costs of travel, including the flight ticket. And so, because it's called it's referred to as a sponsorship system, it means that the employer then ends up actually the immigration process and related rights and responsibilities end up being held by the employer and not by the state.
A lot of domestic workers, migrant domestic workers, once they get to the country of destination, a lot of them have reported that sometimes the employers make them pay back that money. And they say that the fact that it can be quite a costly process, the entire recruitment process, right? It makes the employers feel entitled to them and say, we've had stories of domestic workers saying, once they get there, the employers tell them, okay, I paid $5,000 for you, I basically own you. So it ends up becoming, as some activists and some humanitarian workers have referred it to, as a form of modern slavery. So do you think it's right that the kafala can be equated to modern slavery?
I shy away from using the word slave. when referring to human beings, because in my opinion, no one is a slave. And I also shy away from some of these terminologies that we see being used in the space, like space, like illegal, an illegal person. No person is illegal, no person is a slave. It's just that sometimes we find ourselves, or someone finds themselves in very exploitative situations. But to call someone a slave, I feel anyway, in my opinion, that it dehumanizes that person. And I, again, referring to someone as an illegal person, again, it just completely dehumanizes that person. I think, we should, as we are discussing and defining and talking about the experiences of migrant workers, and especially migrant domestic workers in the Middle East, I think we also have to be careful about the way we refer to them and the way we speak of them, because it can also we can be part of the problem, really. But having said that, just going back to your question, whether the kafala system then places this migrant domestic workers, especially in a vulnerable position, then my answer is yes, it does, because if you have the immigration basically responsibility falling under the employer, meaning that it is the employer that will not only cover the cost of travel, including the visas and the visas and the passport, but then also will be responsible for buying the flight, because usually the migrant domestic workers from Kenya and elsewhere in East Africa will go to the Middle East and work for under contracts of 2 years. So usually 2-year contracts. So after those 2 years, the process is that, and the requirement is that then the employers should then cover their flights, the cost for the flights back, but of course also any other processing of any visa documentation. If there's any exit visas or exit permits to be processed, that should be done by the employer. So basically, the employer then has this wide responsibility, and then at the same time also, it also means that the same employer also has this wide array of powers, and feels entitled quite often to confiscate the passport, because they feel that we paid for this anyway, and you've come here, we've paid for everything, so we are very right to take your passport. We have every right to overwork you. I was involved in a research quite recently, and we were talking to a number of returned migrant domestic workers, not just Kenyan, but also others from other parts of East Africa. And one of the things they complained about is just the number of working hours. On average, they're working 17 hours, 14 hours, 17 hours a day. How many of us work that long? And this is like hard labor, because the houses they're working in are quite big. Quite a number of families in these parts of the world, in the Arab region, are quite big, because they're not just living, it's not just a nuclear family setup. It's you have extended family members. Some of them will actually be required to go and work, not just in one their employer's home, but also their employer's relatives' home on a regular basis. So they are working long hours. Their passport has been confiscated. Their movement is restricted. Sometimes they're not even allowed to use their phones. So even their phones, they might travel with their mobile phones, but those phones are also confiscated, or the employers will restrict their use of the phones, or they'll hover around as they're using the phones to sort of just manage them. So, when people say slave-like conditions, I think those are some of the things that they refer to. And of course, also what we had when talking to some of the returnees. And again, as I said, it's not just Kenya. I think this reflects, this issue is reflected across the region. Again, it's just abuse. If someone feels that they own you and they've paid for you, then they feel entitled to abuse you. They feel entitled to insult you, to call you names, to not feed you. Some women will say that they were only eating once a day. Sometimes they're given food. They're asked to wait until the 5 family members finish eating, and they'll share. It's a culture where people are eating from the same plate or from the same tray, and they are told to wait until all the family members. And a lot of times they're using their hands to eat. All the family members to finish eating and then, eat from that same plate. They eat basically what we call in Kenya bakshish, basically leftovers, but that people have touched, which culturally, from our context, in Kenya, that's not culturally acceptable. It's actually quite an insult. So those are some of the challenges that the migrant domestic workers have shared with us, not only as Send Us Home Kenya campaign, but also just generally speaking, given my engagement with them in other interventions.
Yeah, I think it's also quite important to mention that migrant domestic workers under the kafala are not allowed to leave their contracts or even leave their employers until their contracts end, which sometimes means that even when they get into very exploitative situations or abusive situations, they're forced to continue doing that type of work until their contracts finish. Because if they run away, they risk becoming undocumented, and undocumentation could mean risk of being deported or risk of being arrested in very terrible conditions in a foreign country. But I want to understand, outside of that, a lot of domestic workers, migrant domestic workers, even when going through some of these situations in Lebanon, for instance, and then if they manage to come back to their country of origin, so for instance like Kenya, quite a lot of them tend to migrate again, often to a different country. And also the other thing that I want to touch on is that even though other Kenyan women and Kenyan men as well have heard about these stories of exploitation and stories of abuse, there's still quite a drive for people going outside of Kenya to do these jobs, right? So what do you think keeps people going? What do you think still motivates people to migrate abroad and do this work, even though we've heard about these accounts, really horrible accounts, and especially people who have experienced these things themselves, but they still decide to go abroad?
Okay, so first of all, to your first point on the contract, yes, definitely. Obviously the migrant domestic worker is tied to the employer. So if they choose to leave, and sometimes they will choose to leave because the conditions are exploitative. They are not being paid. You mentioned earlier about how some employers will expect the migrants on arrival to pay off the money that the employer used to cover their travel costs, which is actually not, obviously, it's first of all, it's a violation. It's a violation of human rights, but also at the same time, it's not, that's not the arrangement, and it's not what has been agreed upon, especially in those cases where Kenya has signed a bilateral labor agreement with those countries of destination. Kenya has not signed, as I know at the moment, we've signed 3 bilateral labor agreements with countries in the Middle East, including Saudi Arabia, and we are also in the process of negotiating other labor agreements with other countries in the Middle East. We haven't signed with Lebanon yet, so that's could be part of the problem. And then secondly, on your question, first of all, what happens when they leave their employers, or they run away, or they're dissatisfied with their working conditions? They have various alternatives. So sometimes they will go to the agent at the country of destination before they left the country, and have the details of where the agent of who the agent in the country of destination is, and where their offices are. And they will go back. They will go to that agent. And the idea is that the agent then will find an alternative. We've heard of cases where they'll go to the agents and they'll be forced either to go back to the same abusive employer, because apparently they've signed a 2-year contract, and the expectation is that they should finish that 2-year contract before asking to leave or wanting to leave. Or then they refuse to go back, or there's that tension and conflict between them and the agent, and they're told them, well, in that case, then you'll have to stay here, and then the agent actually ends up being the exploitative party. There was some a recent article in the news about the impact of COVID on migrant domestic workers in Saudi Arabia and also in the Middle East. And those are such as a case actually that was highlighted by that article, talking about a Kenyan lady who went to the agent, and the agent was, because obviously either they weren't very happy with the working conditions, or the employer became actually more abusive during COVID and more restrictive. And so they ran away and went to the agent. And the agent then responded to that by placing this lady with a group of other ladies in a tiny room and then locking them up in that room. Tiny room with just a small window, one toilet shared by a number of, migrant domestic workers who came to that country, to Saudi Arabia, agent, and locking them up and just really being abusive. One of the ladies was actually tied up because she protested to the treatment. So that's the kind of experiences these ladies are going, having to grapple with, not only under the hands of the employers, but also under the hands of the agents. You asked the question as to why, if this is what we're seeing in the media, if these are the challenges that we're hearing, and obviously when you go on social media, you go on Facebook especially, there's lots and lots of accounts of the experiences of the migrant domestic workers, especially in the Middle East. But I have to say that not all stories are negative. Personally, I've had stories of migrant domestic workers going to Egypt, for instance, and earning as much as $700 per month and being paid on time, and even earning, a little extra, tokens, and being given like gifts by the employers. There have been cases of, accounts of migrant domestic workers going to the UAE as well, Dubai, for instance. And even Saudi Arabia, there's some good examples and positive stories coming from Saudi Arabia. So not everyone's experience is negative. I would say that quite a number, probably the majority of the experiences are negative or are problematic. But there are some positive stories as well. There are stories of women who go and they don't struggle, they don't suffer from any abuse, including among the women that we've engaged with who are currently in Beirut.
Yeah.
But the fact still remains is that, this is happening, and it's happening to quite a number of them, to a majority of them. And it's not just happening to Kenya. It's happening to others as well.
Yeah.
First of all, it's that, again, speaking, it's also hope that, we've had the positive stories, maybe this time around to be better. Or perhaps they had a positive, they finished their 2-year contract, they were paid on time, they were not, they did not experience very negative working conditions. They came back, the employer was good, the employer paid for their home, they couldn't find any opportunities, and they chose to migrate again.
Yeah. Okay. I know you mentioned earlier that the government, to an extent, through signing labor agreements with some of these countries of destination, they're kind of facilitating that labor migration process and encouraging it to an extent as well, and also benefiting from the remittances being sent back home, right? But I want to touch on some of the things that the government, the Kenyan government in particular, has done, or even the countries of destination, what their governments have done to kind of address this issue, because it's something that has been talked about for a decade or even longer now, and a lot of human rights organizations in particular are very vocal about it. There's a lot of media reports and documentaries highlighting this situation. So what do you think has been done by the governments in terms of protection mechanisms for migrant workers?
There has been, in terms of the policy response, there have been, policy dialogues that have been ongoing, as far as I know, for the last decade, since 2010. There's been policies drafted to respond to the issue of, labor migration and migration in general. So there's a, labor migration policy that has been drafted, labor migration management bill. that, as far as I know, is yet to be passed. Ahead with adopting a national migration policy that just looks comprehensively at migration. Not just looking at labor migration specifically, but just looking comprehensively at emigration of Kenyan nationals to other countries, but then also immigration. Yes. So in terms of the policy developments, that's where we are at the moment. And as I said, as far as I know, that the bill has not been passed yet. But I do know that the Ministry of Interior, the Immigration Department, the Ministry of Interior, of course, in collaboration with the Ministry of Labour and Social Protection, and I don't know to what extent the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is involved in this, but I do know that there's been obviously discussions, across these different ministries and the relevant, state agencies that fall under them.
Yeah.
So of course, labor migration is primarily a labor issue. So the Ministry of Labour is at the front line recently employment agencies was formed under the Ministry of Labour, and the idea for this agency really is to its mandate really is around not only facilitating or looking at the issues to do with emigration for labor of Kenyan nationals for labor to other countries, but then also just managing the accreditation and the registration and accreditation of the employment recruitment agencies, or rather the private employment agencies. And just ensuring that that these agencies are obviously operating legally. And this came about the need for creating this agency and also just this requirement that the private employment agencies are registered and accredited.
So that came off the back of these accounts of abuse and exploitation that we're hearing about.
Yeah. So this requirement came off the back of this accounts, especially in the media of Kenyan migrant workers, and particularly Kenyan migrant domestic workers being abused in Saudi Arabia and other countries in the Gulf and the Middle East. And so what the Kenyan government did a few years ago is to deregister all private employment agencies, and then require them to go through a process of registration and a process of also accreditation. So the accreditation, as far as I know, was not a requirement at the time. But then also the government responded by putting in place a migration ban of Kenyan workers to go to the Middle East. Because the idea was, put this ban in place, and then look at the regulatory framework, look at the factors that are leading to all these challenges and the abuses and the exploitation that we were seeing in the media at the time.
So these things have been done at least in the last 3 years or less. But as recent as today, or even as recent as 2020, we're still hearing these stories. So do you think there's a lack of enforcement in terms of making sure these processes are actually being done in practice rather than just existing under the law?
Yeah, obviously it's not enough to draft. First of all, the laws need to be passed, right? The bill needs to be passed. It hasn't been passed yet. But then, the labor administrative processes, right, that are already recognized, and especially countries like Saudi Arabia, where we've signed bilateral labor agreements. But regardless, I'd like to argue that these processes should cut across all migrant domestic workers from Kenya going to all countries in the Middle East, regardless of whether we sign those bilateral labor agreements with those countries or not. But of course, there has to be, first of all, NEA needs to be strengthened, and it needs to be able to, together with, generally speaking, other counterparts in the Ministry of Labour, it needs to be able to actually monitor as an agent, as a state agent, needs to be able to monitor the enforcement of some of these regulations. It needs to be able to monitor the employment agencies. Yeah. The attestation process, for instance, when you compare to what we do in Kenya and what other countries do, migrant domestic workers in Zanzibar, for instance, and actually not just the domestic workers, other migrant workers, generally speaking, will go to the Ministry of course, I recognize that Zanzibar is much smaller than Kenya, but the Ministry of Labour has information days every week. And the migrant workers are supposed to go there in person, and they're supposed to interact with the labor officials, and they're supposed to get pre-departure information, and they'll be asked, so you signed this contract, are you familiar with the contents of the contract? Do you understand what it is that you're signing for? Do you understand that this is your wage? You'll be paid X amount of money every month. Do you understand you're actually going to Saudi Arabia and not to Kuwait? Because sometimes these migrant workers, and we found that the cases where they'll sign a contract, sometimes which is in Arabic, it's not even English, so they don't even know that they're signing. Some of the women we've talked to have signed contracts at the airport. So I mean, again, just to answer your question, yes, it's a matter of enforcement and just regular monitoring, regular monitoring of the agencies. We've heard that they're brokers as well. So who are these brokers? Because the recruitment process, to be able to recruit people to go to the Middle East, it's not just, you can't just sit behind a desk, you have to go to the communities as well. So some of these agencies work with brokers and community members, especially in counties like Kwale and Mombasa, where they're key counties of origin for migrant workers to the Middle East. So I think, just answering your question, there's a question of first of all passing these laws that have been developed and haven't been passed yet, but then also just enforcing and monitoring the relevant parties, including the agents.
Yeah. Okay. And in terms of bringing and repatriating the workers from the countries of destination, in cases where they get there and the employers, for one reason or another, breach the contracts, right? For instance, they underpay them or they overwork them, or any other situations that might occur. Do you think there are any processes under the law that kind of explain what happens in that situation? And if there are, why do you think they're not being monitored or even enforced in practice?
Well, the private employment agencies that have been accredited, and the last time I checked on the NEA website, there's a list there, and there's a list of 320. The last I checked, which is a couple of weeks back, sometime in maybe early September. So these agencies must pay a bond of 1.5 million shillings each on an annual basis, because they have to renew their accreditation on an annual basis. Their accreditation is not permanent. They have to keep being reviewed, and they have to keep being accredited. And 1.5 million shillings for one agency alone, I mean, that's a pretty penny. And the idea is that this money should go to a bond, and according to the labor regulations, this bond is supposed to cover the cost of repatriation, and because it's an insurance bond, it's also supposed to cover the cost of any unpaid wages. And this amount, and this is actually required by law under the Labour Institutions Act, which was amended in 2016. What is not clear are two things. The first is whether this bond is meant to cover all Kenyan migrant workers abroad, meaning regardless of country of destination. It's also not very clear whether this bond should cover the repatriation costs and non-payment of wages for migrant workers that go through other means, other channels, because we've obviously observed that there are migrant workers that are going to the Middle East and elsewhere, through brokers or through agencies that are not registered and accredited to the Ministry of Labour. So the question is, in such situations, if they find themselves, in need of repatriation, they find themselves in very, exploitative situations, do they have, under this Labour Institutions Act, do they have a say or a right to, to request for this repatriation assistance? It's also not very clear what the process, would be. As we saw in Beirut this year, when we saw that hundreds of Kenyan migrant workers, most of them women, some of them were women who had children, women who are pregnant, found themselves homeless and on the streets, following, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic and the effect it had on people's attitudes, including the employers of this migrant women, fears, obviously, and the restrictions, but then also economically, of course, COVID-19 pandemic has had an impact at an economic level, both at the household or microeconomic level, but then also at a macroeconomic level. And we've seen that play out. We saw that play out in Lebanon, and of course, it had a direct impact on migrant workers, and especially migrant domestic workers, which, by virtue of the fact that they work in people's homes, and by virtue of the fact that they are contracted under the kafala sponsorship system, and of course they will find themselves in very difficult and vulnerable situations, which then, obviously ended, they found themselves being kicked out quite unceremoniously in certain situations, and found themselves being kicked out or being driven with their belongings outside and being left outside the Kenyan embassy or the Kenyan consulate rather in Beirut. Quite recently, I believe it's 2 weeks ago, in September, at least mid-September, around September 11th, we saw in Kenyan media that the CS of Labour and Social Protection, announced the Migrant Assistance Fund, which, from what we've seen in the media, is supposed to, we're not very clear whether it's a direct response to the Beirut situation, or whether it's just generally a direct response to the repatriation needs of Kenyan workers in various countries in the Middle East and Asia and elsewhere in the world, following, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic, because the repatriation needs, obviously, we've seen them beyond the Beirut situation. So what is again not clear to me and to others that I've spoken to is, what is the difference between this Migrant Assistance Fund and what the Labour Institution Act provides in terms of a bond that all the accredited private employment agencies contribute to. What we saw on the news is that, and what the CS announced, is that this Migrant Assistance Fund is supposed to cover welfare costs, repatriation costs of Kenyan migrant workers abroad. And what I found interesting was that there's a requirement that the government will provide seed funding, but there's a requirement that the migrant workers themselves contribute to this fund. So then, of course, the question is, what is the difference between this and what is already being provided for under the Labour Institutions Act? How do they feed off each other? I guess it remains to be seen.
Yeah, and I guess he also doesn't really speak about the fact that quite a lot of the migrant workers who get stranded don't get paid for quite a few months. So a lot of them are in already very difficult financial positions. So even to be able to pay this money on a monthly basis or on an annual basis is quite difficult. Quite a lot of migrant workers have dependents, either children of their own or siblings or elderly parents. And the fact that they've been really impacted by the COVID-19 situation, and specifically in Lebanon, the explosion that happened in August. So where does Send Us Home Kenya as a campaign or as a network, where does that fall? And can you tell us why that started?
So Send Us Home was established as a response. Actually, the story of Send Us Home is interesting because it began with a phone call. It began with a phone call from someone who is now within our network, who called to ask, what are Kenyan organizations, NGOs, and other organizations, and of course the government itself, doing. So this was in mid-August. The women had been protesting. The issue of the women being found, the migrant women, African migrant women, not just Kenyan, finding themselves on the street, started early in 2020, since COVID. So probably April, we've seen accounts of Ethiopian migrants being dropped off at outside their embassy in Beirut as well, as early as even. So this issue had been going on, for a while, for a couple of months. But I think it became internationally recognized following a CNN expose that was published, if I'm not mistaken, in either June or July. And it was very specific to the experiences of Kenyan migrant women, and all of them were women. So Kenyan women migrant workers, mostly domestic workers, who found themselves on the streets and protesting outside their consulate. And many of them, from that account and from speaking to them as a Send Us Home Kenya network, had been wanting to go home, way before June, way before, even way before COVID hit. And they had gone to their consulate for support, and they were frustrated because we're not getting the responses that they needed. And the reason why the consulate was a source for support for them, or they sought support from the consulate, was because, of course, as I mentioned, usually under the kafala sponsorship system, the government, the employer has the responsibility of processing travel, documentation, including purchasing the flight tickets for those migrant domestic workers who travel to Lebanon and other parts of the Middle East, under a certain contract. So the employer, after the 2-year period, the employer is supposed to actually support the worker by processing any documentation that is required, but also purchasing the ticket for the employee, and allowing the employee to leave in good faith. But since they found themselves kicked out and out of jobs, homeless on the streets, of course, their next source of support, it was quite natural, of course, was to go to their consulate in Beirut. They found the experience from the discussions we've had with some of these ladies who've now come back to Kenya quite frustrating. They were not given the support that they expected or that they had requested for. And so that is exactly how the protest began, and that's how actually this story was covered by CNN, and then eventually went viral on social media, and it became quite an urgent situation because compared to other African countries who had migrant workers in Beirut at the time, and of course the situation was worsened by the fact that on August 4th there was a blast in Beirut. That actually affected over 300,000 people directly. Quite, thousands of people found themselves homeless. And of course, in such a situation, the most vulnerable of them, because from what we've heard from our contacts in Beirut, quite a number of the locals, of the Lebanese locals were being housed. There's a sense of communal help and communal support, and people are opening up their doors to their fellow Lebanese nationals. But the question, of course, is now for families that are affected by the blasts. that have already been affected by the economic consequences of COVID, then do they have the space to actually continue housing this migrant domestic worker?
Yeah.
Now, a number of times the answer was no. And so some of the workers were directly affected, of course, by the blast as well, on top of COVID, and on top of the economic challenges that the country had been going through since late last year, late 2019. And so that is how Send Us Home was born as a campaign, as a volunteer-led campaign, in response to this issue. But really, the catalyst was this phone call that came and that really challenged us and that asked us, what are you people who have either engaged with migrant workers or have worked in the space or are passionate about the issue, or are Kenyans, what are you doing about the fact that hundreds of your nationals are out protesting on the streets? And really, the cry from these migrant workers in Beirut was that they just wanted to go home. And that is how Send Us Home was born.
Okay. And also, just before we get onto the question of whether there are quite a lot of organizations working in this space and dealing with migrant domestic workers specifically, can you give us an outline of what Send Us Home Kenya is doing now in response to these challenges?
So yeah, I mean, so as I said, really the birth of Send Us Home Kenya was to just respond to the needs of these Kenyan migrant workers who found themselves homeless and destitute, really, on the streets of Beirut this year, in mid-2020 especially. But it became quite urgent for us to do something because we were seeing that, other nationals, other countries that have nationals in Lebanon were more organized. For instance, the ambassador of the Kenyan ambassador, from my understanding, actually, I'm not quite sure there's a Ghanaian ambassador to Lebanon or to another country that is accredited to, has a consulate that's accredited to in Lebanon. But I mean, this gentleman was working day and night to fundraise for the cost of repatriation for his nationals. From what we hear from our networks, this ambassador, raised funds from members of parliament back in Ghana, and really quickly mobilized this money and was able to support over 1,200 migrant workers, Ghanaian migrant workers. We saw that in the Ethiopian, civil society organizations and other players who are supporting the Ethiopian migrant workers in Lebanon. There are not as many Ugandan migrant domestic workers in Lebanon compared to the Ethiopians or the Kenyans and the Western Africans. But it did appear that, at least for these countries that in many ways are at the same level of economic development as Kenya, or are even like in terms of economic capacity, Kenya is actually doing better than them. We saw them act faster, and we saw them support their nationals much faster than the Kenyan migrant workers. So the situation of the Kenyan migrant workers in Beirut was quite critical, and we felt really that we needed to do something about it, and that's how we ended up coming together as a group of well-wishers and volunteers and organizations as well to address this issue. Initially, to raise funds to cover the cost of the repatriation of some of the ladies. But as time progressed and as we took time to organize ourselves and really, come up with a strategy, fundraising strategy and whatnot, the need then shifted, and as more and more Kenyan migrant workers were able to get the cost of their tickets covered by well-wishers and volunteers in Beirut. The focus of the campaign then shifted to supporting the ones who are arriving because of course many of them were coming back, as we keep hearing at Send Us Home nowadays, they were coming back with nothing. Some of the stories we've had is that either they were paid for a month or for a couple of months, and then the employer stopped paying them. Or the employers, confiscated their documents, did not, confiscated. We've had cases where some of the ladies will say, my employer actually stole my salary. So the employer pays you and then takes the money back from you, steals the money from you, which is, a bit, so many of them are coming back with not much, either, absolutely nothing, or really very limited funds, and not much to show for the fact that they've lived abroad, some of them for years, some of them for more than 2 years. And so, of course, there's in addition to that repatriation support, there's the need for now supporting their return process and their reintegration back into the Kenyan community. And what we're doing at Send Us Home Kenya, which is basically just a small group of, as I said, of volunteers, and we have a trade union called Kutheha that works with domestic workers and workers in the hospitality and in education sector as well. We have one of their staff also working as a Send Us Home volunteer, and obviously we really would like to recognize and appreciate just the role that they have played in the establishment of this network. But then also we have contacts in Lebanon that have, and these contacts are not only the migrant domestic workers themselves, who we are calling our community organizers, because they're really organizing their fellow Kenyan nationals and really providing that emotional support in these challenging times, but then also working with us to help us mobilize and to support them. And of course with the volunteers, and as well as an organization that works very closely with migrant domestic workers in Lebanon as well. So that is basically the way that the Send Us Home campaign is structured. I keep saying this because I can't believe we are only a month old, just given how much we've been able to achieve. And given the fact that the core group of volunteers is busy, it's spread out in different locations, very, very busy with their day-to-day work and their, of course, other competing demands. But it's amazing how much, with this spirit of just action and just really the spirit of wanting to do something and to address an injustice, just how quickly we've been able to come together and mobilize and really act. It's been such an inspiration. It's the reason why I'm able to work over the weekend. Because it's such an inspiration. And Brenda, you're part of it. So thank you.
I think
that's what we're offering. But please,
I think it's also important to recognize how strong the sense of collective action amongst the domestic workers themselves, the migrant domestic workers, and even just organizing themselves and coming together to organize a protest and do something about their situation. I think that for me in particular has been very inspiring. And, we've seen the Kenyan migrant workers specifically being the most vocal out of all the nationalities that have been impacted. So that sense of collective action has been very strong to see and very inspiring. But what I want to ask is, what sort of support would you like or would you wish to get from other Kenyans for Send Us Home campaign? What do you want them to contribute to help make this a success?
So of course the foundation of Send Us Home Kenya is just this as you're saying, the collective spirit, the spirit of collective action, and the spirit of volunteerism, because we're all doing this for free. No one is paying us, and we're doing this because we strongly believe in a more just world. And a more just world, we can look at different aspects of what justice means, or different, socioeconomic issues. But we've chosen to focus on migration for for various reasons, both personal and professional. But ultimately, as you were saying, for me, beyond the volunteers, the core group of volunteers, and we are working with, besides the core group of volunteers, of course, we have a group of psychologists and counselors who are all affiliated with the Kenya Association of Psychologists and Counselors, who again are offering their services completely, absolutely for free to these returning domestic workers. Because as I said, a lot of them are coming back home, not just with nothing financially, but really, really traumatized. They have had to deal with a lot, and not just in the last 2 months when they were out on the streets of Beirut. A lot of them, in terms of their experiences in Beirut, in Lebanon, have been very, very difficult. They've suffered from a lot of abuse. They've suffered from a lot of, not just physical, but some of them have actually, unfortunately, suffered from, sexual abuse as well, at the hands of the employers, at the hands of the agents in the countries of destination as well. So a lot of them are coming back, traumatized. A lot of them are coming back with a lot of, just stress and frustration. And added to that stress is the fact that now you're coming back and there's expectations from your country, from your family in your home country, that you've been abroad for X number of months or X number of years. And what are you coming back with? What are you coming back with? Is that expectation that you've been abroad? There's a certain status attached to going abroad. The expectation is that when you come back, you're coming back with a lot. And so if you come back home, you've left your children. I mean, I'll give you a concrete example of one of the ladies that we're supporting. She was made, she came back after being on the streets in Beirut. She was able to come back with the support of a Lebanese well-wisher who paid for her ticket to come back home, and of course the COVID tests. But on arrival, she went back to her parents' home. And she was, her family was not very happy with her because she had left her children with her parents. And the idea was that she's gone abroad, so she should be able to support her children, but also support her extended family, including her parents. And of course, when she went to Beirut, she was not paid, as is common. She was not being paid regularly. So she mentioned that she actually only was able to send money once to Kenya. So her parents actually had to take a loan to pay for the school fees of her children. And then she comes back from Beirut and she's coming back with zero, no money. I mean, her parents were very frustrated with her, and she's not going to start trying to explain to them that these are the challenges that are faced in Beirut, because they are struggling as well here in Kenya. And so she's found herself, and that's at the point of our engagement with her, is that she was practically homeless. So those are some of the cases that we are managing, and with some of the challenges we've identified, or that the returnees have shared with us. We are referring them, and we really appreciate the good work that the counselors and the psychologists in our network are doing, because again, these are not easy. These are not easy cases to deal with. Lots and lots of trauma involved. But we are also providing one-off stipends to every returnee in our network, and the network is slowly expanding. And I keep saying that it's expanding faster than we can manage, because, as I said, we are all volunteers. So we don't have the luxury of time. And we're having to work late nights. We're having to work Saturdays. Some of us even on Sundays. But I think it's just, we're seeking also additional support in terms of finances, because we besides the referrals to the counselors, we have two volunteer doctors as well, medical doctors, who are providing telemedicine for the more serious medical cases. But in addition to that, also we're providing this one-off cash stipend. And the idea is for this stipend to 6,000 Kenya shillings, which is about $60 US. And the idea is that this one-off stipend then will be used by these ladies to cover their basic needs, including even the transportation from Jomo Kenyatta International Airport to their home counties. Because a lot of them are coming back without even money for the transport from JKIA to elsewhere, Nairobi, other counties, including, Kiambu County, Mombasa. We have some ladies who are from Mombasa, Western Kenya as well. So to cover those costs, but then, food as well. Some lady, some of them have used the money to cover part of it to cover rent, 1 month rent.
Yeah.
So I think in terms of support, we're looking for more donations, but then also beyond money. I think it's just we're asking Kenyans and other concerned parties to just really educate themselves. And I think it's a challenge also. It's something that we keep challenging ourselves as well as Send Us Home Kenya, is that we need to keep educating ourselves. We need to educate ourselves about, what is the regulatory framework here in Kenya, but then also like within the Eastern Africa, like within the IGAD region, within the East African Community region. But also, what is good practice? Let's learn about why are people migrating in the first place. I mean, that was one of your first questions, Brenda, is why do people migrate? And there are various factors. So why are people migrating? But then what is the best practice? Because people will always moved. It's the beginning of time. It will continue moving. So you can't stop people from moving. Basically, we're looking for donations. We're looking for volunteers. We're asking people to educate themselves, but then also to join the network, because we can't change. If we want to change, or if we want to actually tell the story of this migrant workers, and the story of migration, the experiences of the migrant domestic workers, and not just in Beirut, because now we are hearing requests from migrant domestic workers from other parts of the Middle East. And it's obviously an issue, not just in Lebanon but elsewhere. So I think it's join us, volunteer with us, donate. We're also looking for agencies that we can refer these ladies to. Many of them are looking for, thinking now. You talked about organizing in collective action. We are encouraging the returnees who've come back from Beirut, who are working with the Send Us Home, or who form part of the Send Us Home network, start thinking now beyond, the small level of support that we've provided and we can provide for them, and start thinking about what they can do as a group, because they have come together, they have shared experiences. None of us as volunteers have been to Lebanon, so we cannot speak to that experience. None of us have the experience of working as migrant domestic workers in Lebanon, or experiencing the challenges that these women have faced in the context of COVID-19, and of course the Beirut blast. So they have that shared experience. They have the shared experience of coming back to Kenya and the challenges that they faced upon return. So we're encouraging them to self-organize, to come together as a group and organize, and then figure out, beyond the support that Send Us Home Kenya has provided them, what else can they do? And I think it's much easier for us as a network to support them as a group.
Okay, that's excellent. Okay, so we are on social media. We're very big on connecting through the social media networks. So we have a Twitter account called Send Us Home Kenya, where we're very active, and anyone who wants to get involved, whether you're a journalist or you're an organization working within this sector, you can contact us through our Twitter account. Send us a message. We have our email address as well. If you'd prefer to send us an email, do feel free to reach out through our email, which is sendushomekenya@gmail.com. We also have a website which outlines all the work that Send Us Home Kenya does and who's involved in this campaign, and also keeps track of our progress and what we've been doing since August 2020. So if you want to keep up to date with what we're doing, you can find us through our website, sendushomekenya.org. You can also donate. If you'd like to donate, you can visit our website, and we have a donation page, which you can donate through various means. So if you want to give any amount of money, would absolutely be useful for the migrant workers who are part of our network. So you can also donate on our website. Alternatively, if you're based in Kenya and you'd like to donate through M-Pesa, you can reach out to us. We have our helpline, which is also on the website. So you can feel free to message us or email us. So is there anything else that you'd like people to know, especially Kenyans?
We are not too far removed as Kenyans from the experiences of these women, and anyone can find themselves in this situation. The world is changing very rapidly, and as the more the world becomes interconnected, and we've seen with the spread of COVID that COVID just shows us just how interconnected the world is, because COVID was really spread because of because of movement from from China and then to other parts of the world. So the world is interconnected, and I think and I say this because I've talked to some of the Kenyan migrant workers that have been affected by the Beirut blast, and to a part of the women who are protesting, and they've said, Nkirote, I've been asked by my fellow Kenyans, why did I take myself there in the first place? So there's an element of beyond understanding and awareness of the structural factors that force people to migrate or push people to migrate. I think there's just a lack of humaneness, really, in how we look at the issue. And that I think it's quite easy to forget that for us who are back home, that just like there's no difference between us who are here and our fellow Kenyans who are elsewhere, who are also looking to improve their lives, who are looking to pay their bills, and who have seen migration as a means to that end. And that it might be quite easy to point fingers and to criticize and to just be insensitive about the issue if you're comfortable back home and you don't have to necessarily struggle. So we could find ourselves, those of us who are criticizing these women for choosing to migrate in order to improve their livelihoods and to support their families. Unfortunately, that could be a reality for many of us because of the impact of COVID, amongst other things. So I think it's just a matter of just being a bit more thoughtful. I think that's the word, a bit more thoughtful in how we talk about the issue. And I think this cuts across not just society, but then also when you think about the actors, like different actors. We've talked about the role of government and different ministries, but I think also media. Basically, I'd like to end with that, is that any of us could find ourselves in that situation. But even if we don't, then we just need to be more sensitive. We need to be more, I suppose, look at the issue in a more nuanced manner, but then at the same time also be more open to learning, because there's a lot to learn and there's a lot of we don't know about